Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Scroll Saw Corner. I recently saw a interesting looking project on one of the Facebook groups that I'm in and I thought I'd share it with you all today. It's a fairly quick craft project. I finished it in about a half an hour or 40 minutes or so, from applying the pattern to making the cuts and taking the photograph. So it's this Christmas tree right here, and it's really neat. It's something that the person who posted it on Facebook said that he's had a lot of success selling it at craft fairs, so that might be something interesting for you. But for me, I just thought it looked kind of neat, and it uses the angled cutting kind of like you do on a collapsible bowl, and that was pretty fun. So I thought I would make a video and share it with everybody. Hope you enjoy. So first off, I'd like to thank Paul Ricks for sharing this pattern. I think it's a little bit different than normal things. It looks a little bit more organic, not too symmetrical, which I think is kind of interesting. So Paul, thanks for sharing this pattern. Right now I'm still just cutting at a flat 90-degree angle perpendicular to the table because I felt like having the outside edges square would work out fine, and I wanted the base of the tree, the trunk, to be square so it would fit into a square or rectangular hole on the base. One of the things that I like to do when I'm doing a project like this with the angled cutting is I like to drill a hole that's larger than I normally would, because it allows me to get the blade in at the right angle without having to get the drill angle accurate. Sometimes you can do it really easily. You can use a guide or something like that, but sometimes you have plenty of waste material and it's easier just to make a hole much larger than you need it to so that you can get the blade in at the proper angle without twisting it. For this pattern, I used 3/4 inch alder and a Pegasus number 5 skip tooth reverse blade. I like using alder on some things. It's soft like pine, but it's not as soft as pine in my experience. I like the tan color of it on this, and the scrap board happened to be about the size of the pattern, so this worked out really well. The finished piece is about 10 inches tall, including the base. So you can see here I'm cutting the outside of the tree out. I did this first. I thought it might be easier for me, and I think it worked out pretty well. Something that you might want to do differently is you might want to cut the smallest piece first, the intersection out, and then work your way out to have the most material still in your hands. Toward the end of the project, it was quite a small piece to hold on to, which I think worked out okay for me, but it might have been easier to do it the other way around. One thing that's nice about this pattern having a little bit more organic lines than having super straight lines and angles is it's a little bit more forgiving. You know, I sometimes I call it coloring outside the lines, but on a pattern like this, and when I'm cutting at an angle, a lot of times I do color outside the lines. But thankfully, this pattern is pretty forgiving, and so as long as you don't get too egregious and you don't overcorrect and make really sharp angles when you try to get back on track, you probably won't really be able to see any deviations from the lines. I think for me, coming in at these different angles was a little bit harder than I expected it to be, but that was probably because we're cutting at a 3-degree angle rather than cutting straight. What worked out well, I thought, was slowing it down. I kept my saw speed up high, but I slowed it down, my movement or my feeding, so that I could turn the piece without trying to move into the blade, rotate the workpiece without feeding forward. And so that let the blade cut its own path. And I think that worked out pretty well. Now that it's time to cut the angled portion of the tree out, there are a few things that are important to remember. The first one is determining how deep your project is going to collapse is a function of how thick the wood is, the width of the blade you're using or the kerf that it's going to remove, and the angle that you set your table. On this, I set it at about 3 degrees. I wasn't super particular because these pieces don't have to mate up on the other side. So I think about 3 degrees worked well with this number 5 blade, this 3/4 inch wood, and 3 degrees on the table. The critical thing here, and the part that I've definitely goofed up on in the past, is you want to keep an eye on which direction you're entering the workpiece and what angle the blade is, how it's facing the project for that. The way that I kind of thought about this and was wrapping my head around it is you want the top of your project, the piece where the pattern is at, to be narrower than the lower portion or the back of the board, and that way it can slide forward but will lock in because the back is wider than the front, so it tapers that way. And that may work for you. You may have to find a way that makes sense, but I think that way just worked for me. Anybody who's watched my videos before has probably seen me ask to see what you guys are working on or for you to share it with me. And the easiest way to do that is probably on Instagram. My Instagram is Scroll Saw Corner, and I like to post different projects I'm working on there. You can see things that are in process and maybe some behind the scenes kind of things. But I really enjoy seeing what everybody else is working on. You know, I like talking about Scroll Saw and seeing what other people are doing with the Scroll Saw almost as much as I like using it. So if you've got a project you're working on and you want to share it, I'd love to see it. So once again, I want to thank Paul for sharing this pattern in the Facebook group. One of the things Paul mentioned was that this is a good seller for him at craft fairs. I don't personally sell at fairs, but you can use some of this information to help decide if this is something that might be worth making for you if you sell at craft fairs. This was the first time that I had made this tree, and like I mentioned earlier in the intro, it took me about 30 to 40 minutes. So I think you could realistically make 2 of these in an hour, and if you're using pine or whatever wood you have available, then it may not have a high material cost. The other thing that's nice about it is it's kind of an interesting shape, and it's not just, you know, regular fretwork or something like that. So you could decide if it's worth something selling for you based on what you want to make for an hour's worth of work if you sell 2 of them. I'm sure you could use just about any type of wood for these and come up with some really interesting grain patterns. You might be able to put an easy finish on it, but I think these look just fine without any type of finish applied at all. Once you get done doing all the cutting, you just remove the pattern and push the pieces forward to make your three-dimensional collapsed sort of look. Something that I found is normally I do the blue painter's tape and then spray adhesive to put the pattern on top. If I were doing a lot of these, in order to kind of avoid the tedium of pulling the little bits of blue painter's tape off and potentially cracking at some of the thin joints on here, I would probably just spray adhesive or something, the pattern directly to the wood, and then soak it in a small tray or a shallow tray of mineral spirits to peel that pattern right off. Normally, I don't do that. I just use the blue painter's tape because I think it works out just fine. But if you have a lot of pieces, let's say you're doing this sort of on a production basis to make items for the craft fair, you don't want to spend 5 minutes peeling painter's tape off. That's kind of a pain in the neck. So Mineral Spirits does a great job dissolving the spray adhesive and then doesn't change anything about the finish of your product. All right, and there you have it. We got our three-dimensional tree. Looks pretty neat. I'm not going to put any finish on this or anything like that. I think I'm just going to leave it as is. I like the wood color, and I think it came out pretty well. I hope you get a chance to make some of these, and if you do, share it with me. Thank you. Have a great day.